A few weeks ago, I was watching a video by a channel called A Dose of Buckley, a creator I've enjoyed for a very long time now. Also, one of my inspirations to make rant videos. And he was talking about how now we've reached a point where people are feeling nostalgia for the 2010s. And he said to an extent he can understand it because the kids who are listening to shit like LMFAO in like 2011, 2012 are in their mid-20s now. And also, not to mention, come next year, we'll be right smack dab in the middle of this decade, somehow. But he was mostly pointing and laughing at those who were over-romanticizing the decade and saying ridiculous shit like LMFAO is an OG EDM group, which, yeah, the group who made Sexy and I Know It and Party Dance, or whatever the fuck that song's name was, is an OG EDM group somehow. A genre that predates that group by decades. Anyway, I'm done summarizing his video. If you're interested in seeing it, I'll leave it in the description. Anyway, it just got me thinking a little bit about nostalgia myself and how I sometimes fall into the trap. Now, my opinion on nostalgia isn't all that different from way back when I made that video shitting on 90s kids. What was that, back in 2016, 17, I think? The short and sweet of it is, I think nostalgia is kind of a silly concept. That doesn't mean you can't reminisce about your past every once in a while, but some people tend to make their nostalgia their entire fucking personality. And they have this impulse to dismiss anything that's come after the 90s or the 2000s, or whatever time period they're nostalgic for. And I think it's pointless to constantly be stuck in the past because it's over now, you lived through it, it's behind you, and no amount of whining and crying over the fact that it's over now is going to bring it back. And that's exactly my rationale for not being an overly nostalgic person. That, and also, like I mentioned, people who are overly nostalgic are also super fucking obnoxious. But like I said, I do find myself falling for the trap sometimes. I'm in my 20s now, so old, I know. I've had tragic events happen to me in the last few years, like my grandmother passing away, or my cat Charlie passing away. I just had an online friend who passed away last month also. Not to say I haven't had my struggle with mental health issues prior to 2020, but I have noticed that, it has kind of exacerbated since then. Take those personal tragic events that I just mentioned and also factor those in with the fact that we're not far removed from a pandemic where we had to essentially socially isolate ourselves for an extended period of time. Now, I'm sure you know by this point that I am not the most social person out there. In fact, I tend to prefer solitude, but even I was negatively impacted by this after a certain point. Now, I understand that I probably had it better than a lot of other people out there. I still had my mother, my two uncles, and for the early days of the pandemic, my grandmother, who I lived with at the time and still live with. So I was still getting face-to-face human interaction. Compare that to plenty of other people during the pandemic who didn't get that interaction on a daily basis and lived alone. But even still, seeing the same faces day in and day out, being in the same house day in and day out, was getting so tiresome for me, and I began craving for the days where I would actually go somewhere and see different faces every day. I began community college in fall of 2019, and the lockdown first began in March of 2020, and the remainder of my community college days were entirely online. It wasn't until January of 2022 where I finally got to be on a college campus again and go to classes physically again. And I've seen a lot of people express the sentiment that they feel the time they spent during lockdown was time wasted. People who were just graduating high school at the time were robbed of things like graduation, prom, and other activities and events that people of that age typically get to experience. And that time of your life is especially crucial because that's when you're transitioning away from your teen years and into adulthood. It was a smack in the face to many people in this age group that the world just fucking sucks, and that adulthood isn't exactly what we made it out to be in our heads as kids. What I am building to is, I don't blame people who are around my age for feeling nostalgia for the 2010s. Can it be annoying? Yes. Can people romanticize the fuck out of the decade? Of course. We've already seen this when we were kids and teenagers with people romanticizing the fuck out of the 90s or the 2000s, and now we are at that point with the 2010s. I have a lot of fond memories surrounding the years 2014 and 2017 specifically, and sometimes, these last few years especially, I find myself thinking, God, those years were so fucking good, I would kill to relive those memories again. And then I'd snap out of it and think, well, that's the past now, may as well make the most out of the present because that's all you'll ever have, the present, with the past always being a memory. So if I, someone who has never been a fan of the concept of nostalgia, can sometimes fall into the trap, I don't fault anyone else for reminiscing a lot about their childhoods and teen years. Statistics say that Gen Z is the loneliest generation. A lot of us only get our social interaction on social media. I am most certainly no exception. I have real-life friends that I hardly ever see, and I mostly talk to on Instagram, and I also have plenty of online friends who I just talk to on Discord. Obviously, screen addiction was already an issue in the 2010s, but after the COVID lockdown, and for a lot of people, social media was the only form of interaction they were getting during that time. The problem has only gotten worse, and a lot of these lonely people think back to their childhoods, which happened to be the early 2010s, when shit like LMFAO was popular. And they think, I was 10, 11, 12 during that time, and I was so much more carefree back then. I had friends, I was going to school, so I was getting a healthy amount of interaction on a daily basis. Now, me personally, I have very little nostalgia surrounding the music at that time, because even back then I thought a lot of it was dog shit. But with pop culture being so ingrained in all of our minds, it's easy to associate music, TV shows, movies, etc. that came out during our childhood, no matter the quality, with better times. For example, seemingly everyone shat on Five Nights at Freddy's back when it was new, but now that it's considered nostalgic, a lot of people seem to have flipped their opinions on the franchise. You don't get to choose when you're born, so oftentimes you're just exposed to whatever's popular during your youth, and because you experienced those popular songs, movies, TV shows, etc. at the time, you're naturally going to cherish those pieces of media into adulthood. And those pieces of media might not have even been good, but it doesn't really matter to you. What matters to you ultimately is the memories that you associate with those pieces of media. And whatever piece of media that you're shitting on now, like those who shat on your favorite pieces of media when you were a kid, is going to be someone's cherished memory in 10, 15 years. It's just clockwork. So yes, sometimes I'm like, things were more carefree and fun back when I was in middle school, high school. I'd really like to relive those days again. Even though I personally don't like nostalgia, it's a natural human emotion that we're all susceptible to. Anyway, this isn't really a response or a refutation of Buckley's video, more like just an addendum to it, because he's specifically talking about an age group that I fall under. And he's in like his 40s now, and he was already a grown adult in the early 2010s, so it's easy for him to point and laugh at all of those who are now nostalgic for the awful, trite music that came out back then. But I can still understand it more and relate more with the people he's talking about in his video, because after all, I do fall under the age group he's talking about specifically in that video. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Bye-bye.